But Bushan has arrived with the mining gospel. Thank you very much.
Since coming into government, Shane Jones has set about revitalising New Zealand's mining industry.
We will not be deterred in the creation of a fast-track piece of legislation so mining, roading, infrastructure and other big developments that keep Kiwis and their kids in New Zealand can take place without being hijacked, diverted, distracted by a group that are woke-riddled climate believers and who don't accept...
Meanwhile, those woke little climate believers haven't been so happy.
What do we want? No money! When do we want it? Now!
It's a stupid thing to do. Don't put conservation land aside and then decide to mine it.
A lot of people have come from Thames today, about 3 buses, and we're here to say no, it's not okay. We want our voice heard.
The details Sharon Brett-Kelly's been at CHOGM, that's the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in Samoa. Sustainability and the future of the planet featured heavily. There have been conversations about disaster resilience, resilient futures, climate finance. The topic at the business forum there was the global economy, what's next? So why was the top spot at that forum given to the CEO of Fortescue, which is Australia's $66 billion mining and energy company? Sharon sat down with Dino Otranto to find out more about how and if a mining company can be clean and green.
We're headquartered in Perth, Western Australia, and listed on the Australian Stock Exchange.
Okay.
Have operations predominantly in Australia, but now diversifying our footprint around the world.
Oh, you are? Okay.
Yeah.
Where else in the world?
So we have a technology centre in Oxford, just outside of London, and manufacturing centres there. We have also a manufacturing centre of electrolyzers in Queensland now, but we have development projects around the world, in Africa, in exploration in Latin America, and development projects in the US and Europe.
Are you interested in New Zealand at all?
Sure, we have actually had a look at New Zealand. In fact, our energy side of the business is active wherever there are good, cheap sources of renewable energy, and clearly New Zealand is attractive for us, and geography-wise, it's a perfect combination for Australia.
So you're kind of moving into the renewable energy side rather than mining. Is that what you're saying? That's
correct. The two are actually linked. So we announced Real Zero Scope 1 and 2 emissions target by 2030, which is quite aspirational for heavy industrial emitters like us.
Alexia Russell here. We'll come back to Sharon's interview with Dino, but first I asked Newsroom's South Island-based environment reporter David Williams what Scope 1, 2 and 3 are all about. This part is important.
Well, in a general sense, Scope 1 and 2 emissions are what you can control within your little company. So the emissions that come from your own operations. Scope 3 include everything in what they call the value chain. So in the case of a big company like Fortescue, for example, they have 98% of their emissions in Scope 3. That's because they dig up the iron ore and there are emissions associated with that. But then the steel making is done by someone else, and that's the real nasty. That's where the real business is in terms of emissions.
Right, so even though they are physically and financially separated from the processing part, I mean, there wouldn't be any point in processing if they didn't have the raw material, so really they're kind of responsible for the whole thing.
That's right. In the same way that when you're an oil and gas company, you take the stuff out of the ground and you might have a role in transporting it to where it's used, but you don't burn it. So Scope 1 and 2, think about Z Energy when it was talking about emissions, same thing. It didn't actually burn the fuel, but actually the whole point of their company is to do exactly that. If you are a big mining company, you have to look at how it's used, and that should be part of your thinking.
It's variously estimated the steel industry is responsible for between 7 and 12% of the world's CO2 emissions. Here's Dino on what they're doing to try and reduce that.
A lot of the technology is off the shelf for us to get to apply into our mining operations, but a lot of it is not. So we've been scouring the world now and looking for partnerships with small and big companies to develop and bring the technology to our mining operations to help us decarbonise our operations. And what does that mean? It's 3 million tonnes of CO2 and nearly 1 billion litres of diesel equivalency of hydrocarbons that we burn every year. So for us, it's we say it's good for the planet, but actually it's really good for the bottom line, taking away 1 billion litres of diesel consumption in our mining operations.
You talked about this figure 12%. Is that what the industry emits in terms of carbon emissions?
That's right. So we're part of the steel value chain. So iron ore is burnt traditionally with coal to make steel. 90% of our product out of Australia goes into China and is burnt with coal in China, metallurgical coal, where you get exceptionally high volumes of CO2 emitted from the products that we make. We call them Scope 3 emissions. So when I refer to a number which is quite material in the total amount of CO2 that the globe produces, a large proportion of that does come from the steel industry. So our products, directly or indirectly, we have an obligation and responsibility to go downstream. And we've announced plans to build a green metals facility in Australia. We'll have that completed in a year's time, which will demonstrate that you can produce a metal, 95% iron metal, without the use of coal. You can do it by hydrogen as a chemical process, not in the production of electricity. So sometimes there are a lot of myths out there about hydrogen. For us, we're still absolutely wedded to the use of hydrogen in the future, and predominantly through the manufacture of green metal to decarbonise the steel industry.
So successful so far, and you talked about something interesting, how you were in the States getting a green mining truck.
Yeah, what we did is a couple of years ago, actually, we put the call out to all the traditional mining truck suppliers who had equipment that used zero hydrocarbons. And there wasn't anyone out there doing it. In the underground world, electrification has been quite typical for some years, but nobody had used it in a surface mining application where the size of the trucks are so much bigger. We're talking 200 to 300 tonnes in total capacity of these trucks. So the power, the torques that you need are so different. So traditionally, it's been a diesel engine that's produced the horsepower that's required. More recently, you've seen diesel electric, so electric drivetrain trucks come to the market, but we required an electric solution or a hydrogen and electric solution. So we put the call out to the market. Nobody came to the table. And we're set an ambitious target by our chairman, Dr. Andrew Forrest, of doing it ourselves. So we actually built a hydrogen fuel cell electric truck, which produces zero carbon emissions, ran for 8 minutes in less than 100 days. Now, that is unheard of in our industry. Look, it certainly wasn't production ready, but what it did show was that when you brought creativity, capital and will with a great team together, you can achieve some amazing things. And it was almost the very next day where one of the OEMs, in fact it was Liebherr, came to us and said, we'd love to partner with you. I think we could do something amazing together. And in less than 2 years, we've brought a product to market. It's a partnership we have with Liebherr, where Fortescue will be supplying the power system or the old engine, and it's inside a Liebherr chassis, and you can now procure those. And it's the world's first fully green electric mining truck available to the market.
And I think you made a prediction that there'd be 500 of them in the next 2 years.
That's right. 500? So we have a fleet of over 700 pieces of equipment that we need to turn green in the next few years. The order with Liebherr is about 300 to 400 of our mining trucks that we will procure from Liebherr, which we will provide the power systems to. We've also made some announcements with McLean, which is another mining equipment with a similar partnership where we'll provide the power system and they'll provide the graders. We also need dozers, we need wheel dozers, we need excavators, all green. So that's where the numbers refer to.
And just remind me, what's your target again? Is it by 2030 you'll be...
By 2030, completely off diesel.
Completely off diesel, but still a carbon emitter?
No, our target is real zero.
Okay.
So we use hydrocarbons in the generation of electricity as well, not just the consumption of electricity, which we're talking about here. So where we will be turning off our gas-fired power station, our diesel generators over the next few years and replacing them with solar farms and wind farms that we're actually currently building. We've already finished building the high-voltage network, which is nearly 1,000 kilometres worth of high-voltage poles and wires to distribute that renewable energy to these trucks that I've just been talking about.
Wow, a huge investment.
Yeah, it's
costing you
big.
a lot of money.
We've announced a $6.2 billion US investment in this. But we believe it's value accretive because, as I think I mentioned earlier, we're offsetting nearly 1 billion litres of diesel. So we don't have to buy that diesel anymore. It's like your EV at home. You don't need to go to the fuel station anymore. So that, along with the saving we anticipate in the maintenance of these trucks, because there's less moving parts, means that our first generation of equipment is actually on parity with its diesel equivalent. And as battery technology improves over the next few years, you will see that cost curve lower even further.
So if you're doing it, why aren't other mining companies doing it?
I think our journey, it was difficult, right? And I often say that the mining industry is largely criticised by wasting capital. There's a lot of stories in the past where big organisations have wasted shareholders' capital. So we've become a very conservative industry by nature. That, coupled with the heavy safety and environmental responsibilities that we hold, mean that we take a long time to deviate from the traditional accepted means. By investing in some of that early stage R&D on our actual mine sites, and that's one of the differences with us, is that we have an amazing network of mines that we can deploy some of this technology on, where some of the OEMs need to approach a mining company and say, well, OEMs is an original equipment manufacturer, sorry. They need to approach a mining company like ours and beg that they can trial new equipment. Well, when you're the same company, I just deploy it in our backyard. And to answer your question, it really doesn't now leave any excuses to anybody else.
No.
So we've done it. It's commercially available. It's on a great cost comparison with the current diesel equipment on the market. So really, there's no excuse. Go and order one of these trucks.
So how quickly do you think the industry can change like you have?
The good thing about our industry is these trucks come up for the end of their life every 50, 60, 70,000 hours. So we are consistently replacing our truck fleet with sustaining capital. So, in fact, our competition is buying new fleet every day. So really, you can start now.
Mining is a dirty word, and I must admit, when I sat down in that meeting this morning and you were on the panel, this perception of mining companies, the industry is so bad. I was really taken aback.
Well, I really appreciate that. And obviously I'm biased. I'm in the industry and I don't think it's bad. Right? For starters, the products that we make, in our case, the iron ore that goes into making steel, you need those materials to help provide the solutions in copper, in lithium, in nickel, in iron ore, in aluminium. They come from mining organisations. And I do agree with you. I think the paradigm needs to shift on the perception of mining organisations. We're one of the most regulated industries on the planet. If you see the actual impact we make to the environment now, I think you'd be surprised on what we stand for and our values. And now that a company like ours can move into decarbonising what people thought was impossible to make a green product, I think perception will very quickly change. And in fact, during the course of today, I've been inundated with people of the same opinion. I didn't realise that about mining. I thought it was just a big, dirty organisation that dug big holes and that was it. But the reality is once people hear the story, see it for their own eyes, it changes perception very, very quickly.
So what your message is, mining will continue, but it can be done in a green way.
Well, I think we're demonstrating that. And we'll reach peak carbon very, very soon for us and be on a downward trajectory as we start bringing this equipment online and reach real zero by 2030.
I asked David Williams what he knows about Fortescue and what he thinks about their green mining.
Well, I don't mind it. in terms of their ability to try and cut emissions. Because there's a climate crisis, we should do everything we can, right? So, and if you look at what mining does, it provides many of the things that modern societies need, such as steel and rare earth metals for our devices. But then, of course, these companies do have an obligation to react to the climate crisis by drastically cutting emissions. That's what scientists and the big UN bodies tell us. So saying that something's green, I think we should always take that with a grain of salt. It certainly is good corporate branding. But at the same time, if they want to try and cut emissions in their operations, that's a good thing too.
How much do we take Fortescue's sort of presentation at CHOGM that they are greening up? How much sort of value do we place in that?
If you look at Fortescue as the company, its own site says that 98% of its emissions are Scope 3, so outside its control. And so there is a 2% amount of difference that it can make by greening its own operations. The real game here is the 98% they don't control, and that's steel making. And that's where efforts should be concentrated. If they were to entirely green their operations, it would make a very small difference to what the emissions emitted from the greenhouse gas emissions from its value chain in its entirety, the steel making and so forth.
Right, so it's a little bit disingenuous to turn up at CHOGM and say we're greening our mining operation when in a way it's largely irrelevant to the entire process.
Well, you could say that it's disingenuous. I mean, fine, if you want to brand yourself as that, good, all well and good. But I think most thinking people realise what an iron ore mining company does and where its products end up or its materials end up, and they can pretty easily see through that kind of rhetoric.
Interesting though, David. I mean, Fortescue makes all sorts of representations on, federal versus state law on emissions and things like that, sort of basically holding themselves up because they're using hydrogen, they're better for the planet. So in a lot of ways, this sort of lobbying is more, placing yourself commercially ahead of the race.
Oh, yeah, in some ways. I mean, they're a big player, right? I looked on the ASX and said that they were the 10th biggest company. They're a big player in Australia, and Australia's a big oil, gas and mining country, isn't it? So if you were big in those industries, you expect they'd have something to say about regulation at the state or federal level. So it's understandable from their point of view. But when it comes to hydrogen, I think, again, we need to think clearly about what hydrogen is and what it's capable of doing. I mean, it's a costly technology. It's reasonably inefficient in terms of how you make it and then the efficiency of creating and transporting that fuel for the end user. There are actually other technologies that are better. New Zealand's very good at hydrological things, big hydro dams. There's also geothermal as well. There are things existing. We're getting more solar arrays being proposed at a commercial scale. These are well-known technologies. They don't have as many bugs in them. They're done at scale. Maybe they just bet on the wrong horse there. And in fact, if you look at Fortescue, in July, they cut 700 jobs because they were backing away from their big green hydrogen goal, which was to produce 15 million tonnes of the stuff by 2030. So the green hydrogen dream in Australia isn't going as well as they would have hoped.
So in terms of mining companies here in New Zealand, what are they doing that's equivalent to this? Like, are they also trying to green up their image?
Oh, yes, in a word. I don't know if you remember, but there was some great TV with Shane Jones, who was on a massive EV excavator down at Oceana Gold's mine in Macraes.
I was invited down here to celebrate the operationalisation of this machine because it's going to draw on clean green energy.
They had this massive thing that was battery operated, or battery powered rather. And so yes, this seems to be something that's happening worldwide, certainly in New Zealand and Australia. And why wouldn't you do it? I mean, if you're a profitable company or exercise or industry, then that's something you would want to do. You want to make sure that the things that you can control are as green as possible. It's good for your brand when it comes to what that stuff is used for. With something like iron ore, less so for gold, you can draw your own conclusions about where the real gains are for the emissions reductions. Fortescue's been taken to court by the Yinjibarndi people, the traditional owners in Western Australia, I think it is, for the destruction of cultural sites.
Fortescue Metals Group stands accused of destroying over 100 Aboriginal heritage sites in Western Australia. The Yinjibarndi people have battled the mining giant for 15 years, striving to protect their land and culture. A joint archaeological report reveals that 249 sites within the mine footprint were protected under the State Aboriginal Heritage Act. Shockingly, more than half of these sites have been obliterated.
You put that into a New Zealand context, and we've got some of the highest global rates of endangered and threatened native species of flora and fauna. And so extensive mining of those areas could make matters worse. So we really need to think about those things too.
Okay, in Australia, mining go hand in hand, just like New Zealand dairying goes hand in hand. What are we doing in our dairy industry that sort of is equivalent to this? Is Fonterra taking steps? They're still the country's biggest polluter, so is there even a comparison there?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, dairying's different because they actually burn a lot of fossil fuels to dry the milk, right, into powder. And so that is directly done by the company, and therefore that is part of their Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And so, yes, Fonterra, the New Zealand's biggest company, has 2030 targets for its Scope 1 and 2 emissions. And you saw under the previous government, they were handing out money to big polluters, these companies were also spending money, so it was just a bit of an extra hand up to get this done, to make sure that they could do things like make steel or make the liquid milk into milk powder using these big dryers, and do it in a less polluting way. And so that is part of it. But then you get Scope 3, so that's the belching of livestock, and that becomes the real problem. And so, yes, you can look at Scope 1 and 2 emissions again in something like Fonterra, the big dairy exporter. But if you're not dealing with those other emissions from livestock, then you could argue that you're not taking the climate as seriously as you could.
Yeah, these things are all a sort of a case of, we need the end products. We need it not only to, feed the world, in perhaps Fonterra's case, but to keep our economy going. At some stage, do we have to say, okay, well, there is a price to be paid for that. These guys are just going to, we're going to have to let them get away with a certain amount.
I think that it's dangerous when you're in a climate crisis to look at things from the lens of what is happening now. Smart economies and intelligent people come up with solutions and different industries so that aren't as polluting, that can do the same job. I mean, if you look at one of the more prominent things that's been debated around the world in recent years, it's lab-grown meat. A lot of people turn their noses up at that. Some people don't think that'll ever take off. But that is an alternative that people are turning to. And that's an industry, right? So that needs scientists, it needs people, it involves manufacturing, and that means jobs. And so when we look at things from just a lens of a polluting industry and we need that and oh, well, that's okay, neglecting to look at what other industries might pop up that are better for the planet and can do roughly the same job. There was a really cool story on New Scientist. Now, I'm not some kind of crazy geek. I don't go to these places all the time, but it was talking about new technology, and it says that batteries made from water and clay could be used on Mars. And so when you think about that, the idea that you might be able to have batteries from water and clay, there are a whole lot of things that are changing and moving, and the things we might think are just rudimentary elements that can't be used for something, but then smart people put them together and say, we can do this. So there is hope, and I just hope it comes quite quickly.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and New Zealand On Air. This episode was engineered by William Saunders and produced by Sharon Brett-Kelly, Gwen McClure and me, Alexia Russell. Thank you to Dino Otranto and David Williams. Ka kite anō.